How can we trust anything that's in the Gospels if we don't even know who wrote them? Great question. Whether we know who the author is of an ancient text or not doesn't really bear a lot of impact on its reliability. Observe this quote from the first century Jewish historian Josephus. He said he knows people who are eyewitnesses to certain events who wrote down their accounts and made things up, either to flatter the Romans or to express their hatred towards the Jews. So even if the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, that would not automatically make them reliable accounts. Propaganda was a thing 2,000 years ago as much as it is now. So back to the original question, how can we trust anything that's in these ancient writings, like the Gospels? To answer this, historians use kind of a scale from things that we can be almost certain did not happen to things that, yeah, we can fairly say probably did happen. Was Jesus a historic figure who was crucified by Pontius Pilate? Almost certainly yes. Did Jesus' death cause a giant earthquake and a bunch of dead saints to rise from the grave and walk around? Almost certainly no. Everything between those two extremes is graded on a bunch of different metrics, like what we know about that period in history. Luckily, we know quite a lot. To show you what I mean, let's take a look at one out of very few stories about Jesus that can be found in all four Gospels. That is the story of Jesus being arrested and one of his disciples drawing a sword and cutting off someone's ear. There are some differences in those accounts, and I'm going to start by talking about those. And since I've gotten so much positive feedback about it, it's chalkboard time. So first up, let's take a look at Mark chapter 14. They laid hands on him and seized him, but one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus was like, "Why are you bringing so much heat? What am I, John Wick?" Now, this is our earliest account of this narrative. What's interesting about it is Jesus does not condemn his disciples' use of violence. So I'll write that there. Now on to Matthew 26. Jesus does rebuke his disciples, saying, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take up the sword shall perish by the sword." So since this is our second source, that means this little detail was added for some reason. Why? I'll get to that in a little bit. Moving on to Luke 22, Jesus does not say those who live by the sword will die by the sword. No, he says, "Stop, fool," and then he touched the ear and healed it. That little tidbit is not in any of the other Gospels. So again, it was something that was added to the story later. Now to our latest source, John chapter 18. Now it's Peter who draws the sword, not just a random disciple. And by the way, the servant also has a name, Malchus. And voila. Now you might be tempted to say that since there are all these differences, we should just throw the whole story out. But there are notable similarities, which cause scholars to think that maybe there is a nugget of truth to the story. However, still some others think it's unlikely that Jesus' disciples were armed at all. I fall into this category, and I'll explain why. For one thing, it contradicts everything that Jesus taught up to this point. Love your enemy as yourself, bless those who persecute you, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Jesus consistently spoke against violence, so why all of a sudden are his disciples ready to stage an armed rebellion? But maybe the bigger reason is if this did happen, they would have been arrested or more likely killed on the spot. Here's another story from Josephus. You'll have to pause and read, but I'll give you the highlights. This is the story of Theudas, who was another man who claimed to be an apocalyptic prophet who gathered a large following. And when the Romans at least suspected that they were planning an armed rebellion, they sent soldiers to arrest and or kill him and his followers. They even beheaded Theudas right there on the spot. So even though by historical standards this account is multiply attested, in all four of the Gospels, mind you, based on what we know about Roman law and practices, this is probably not a historic account. So yeah, thanks for the question, hope that helped, and feel free to hit me up with any follow-up questions. Love y'all, all the best.
So I was in the process of researching the discrepancies within this story, and I came across this gentleman's video, and he actually makes some very good videos. So, and you know, there's nothing new under the sun, so there's always somebody talking about the same thing. We just highlight different things and different aspects of it. One of the things that I had planned on highlighting even more so than what he did was the fact that the likelihood of the Jesus characters, people carrying, you know, being packed, walking around packing, and I love his John Wick and the way he explained it, but his people walking around packing is very unlikely based on the way the story is told because of Roman law. Now, I know he put more emphasis on the fact that this goes against the teachings of Jesus, but what we should actually focus on is actual true history. One, Pontius Pilate was incredibly ruthless. He was known to go to certain degrees of cruelty when it came to people coming in and around the Passover, preaching this revolution against the Roman government. It was to such a degree that Pilate was being called back to the Roman Empire to face charges of his cruelty in Judea, but the emperor happened to die. And since the emperor died, the whole case fell apart and Pilate went back to Judea. So it is unlikely that he went back to Judea and changed his ways. It is more likely that he went back to Judea and continued to be the ruthless type of person that he was. especially since they were about to go through this period of time where there were like 6 different emperors in the span of like 7, 8, 9 years. So you guys can give me the correct numbering on that aspect of it. But Pilate was known to be incredibly ruthless in his handling of the Jews during the Passover time. So the likelihood of the story of them just arresting Jesus and not seeing that they were armed and not just offing him immediately is unlikely. And if the Jesus character knew Roman law, as he said, give unto Caesar what is Caesar, and follow the rules of Caesar, basically, then it is unlikely that he would have allowed for his people to carry weapons. And since they were, according to the story, they were carrying weapons, then this is more of an armed rebellion and not the peaceful, loving Jesus story that you would normally see. And it's an odd thing to find within the writings, but by the time these writings are being accepted, Christianity is being created within the Roman government under either Vespasian or Titus, most likely during the reign of both of them. And so to add the fact that they were carrying weapons would make the story easier for the Romans to be able to deal with this type of story. If the Romans were hearing a story of these unarmed, peaceful Jewish people who were trying to get their rights and freedom under the Roman government, then the Romans could have taken it as the Roman army militia took advantage of these people and massacred these people if they just killed them all off and they didn't have weapons. But to say that they had weapons and they cut off somebody's ear and then the ear was healed makes it more justifiable to Roman ears of the era to be able to accept this Jesus story as something that possibly could have happened, or more likely, as just easier to digest for a Roman audience. And it is very well noted that Luke and John were written more for a Roman audience, not so much for a Jewish audience, whereas Mark and Matthew were written for more of a Jewish audience. So this is taking some creative licensing in adding these aspects of these stories. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem is that these stories are accepted by people as valid, as true, as the word of God, as every word in it is true. But historically, we can see that these stories cannot be 100% true, that they are filled with propaganda and they are filled with storytelling based on the audience that the story is being told to and the audience that they're trying to convince over and win over in this story. You see, Romans don't like a storyline where the Romans just dominate. They like a little bit of adversity within the story, but the Romans can look like an anti-hero, but they cannot be the complete villain of the story, which is why Pilate in this rendition turns out to be this guy who's washing his hand of the whole ordeal and blaming the people in Judea, which would be favorable to the Roman audience because the Roman audience felt that they deserved to have Judea as a province, as a vassal state under the Roman Empire. And so if they didn't want to paint the Romans to be too cruel because the Romans would not accept that story. So it had to be massaged in such a way that the Romans would accept it. So if you were to accept this story as 100% truth, you have to accept it as this God is purposely trying to make the story fit what the Roman audience of the day would be able to accept. It is the same way that if you were to tell a story of any slave revolts that happened in the Americas, of course, they had to get to an armory, and they got to the armory and it was ready to go kill all the white people. So then they were all just shot and massacred. If the story was that they were just protesting peacefully anti-slavery during that time frame, and y'all know which story I'm talking about, and they just massacred those people who were protesting, the story would not have looked as well. This is why Uncle Tom's Cabin was such an important writing during the Civil War, because it highlighted the cruelty of these Southern plantation owners. So it helped to galvanize the Northerners to continue a fight that they were becoming weary of. These stories are retold, and this same motif is redone over and over again. But what do you guys think? Always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, Good vibrations.